Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event looking at President-elect Biden's tax agenda. I'm Mark Mazur. I'm the Robert C. Posen Director of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's virtual event. We have a packed program today with a number of distinguished guests and a couple of our distinguished staff from the Tax Policy Center. The goal today is to gaze into our collective crystal balls and begin to think through how the president-elect and his team can take the campaign proposals, the tax proposals that they talked about during the campaign, and turn them into legislative initiatives. And also to consider what adjustments might be necessary given the current pandemic, the state of the economy, and frankly, just political realities. By way of background, the Tax Policy Center analyzed the Biden campaign tax proposals and released our analysis in October. There were around 50 separate tax proposals that were included, some tax increases, some tax credits. Over a decade, we estimated that the proposals would collectively raise around $2 trillion. And just about all this revenue would come from corporations and high-income individuals. Our program today is going to start with a conversation between former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew and Tax Policy Center Senior Fellow Howard Gleckman. And that'll be followed by a panel discussion featuring several of the big brains of tax policy. But before we start, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and will be made available, posted online in the near future. All viewers joining today will be muted, so questions for the speakers will need to be written. During the presentations, I urge you all to type questions into the Q&A box. Please include your name and your organizational affiliation and who you're directing the question to, much like you would do if you were asking the question in person. We'll be monitoring the question box and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as we possibly can. And to help us do that, please keep your questions brief and also please put them in a form of questions. I also encourage all viewers to participate on social media using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And now let me turn to the program itself. We're extremely happy to have former Secretary of Treasury Jack Lew joining us today to help frame the discussion and to provide his own insights into the potential agenda for President-elect Biden. Former Secretary Lew has an incredible career spanning public service, work in the nonprofit sector, and work in the private sector. And just in terms of public service, he's been a top congressional staffer for House Speaker Tip O'Neill. He served in various roles in the Clinton administration, including director of OMB. He had a second stint as OMB director in the Obama administration. Then he served as the president's chief of staff, followed by the 76th Secretary of the Treasury, where a portrait of Alexander Hamilton hung outside his office. Jack Lew is a native of New York. And when the Obama administration ended, he returned to New York, and he joins us from there today. And the conversation needs to have at least two parts. So in addition to Jack Lew, we're fortunate to have Howard Gleckman, Senior Fellow at the Tax Policy Center, to hold up his half of the conversation. Howard is the editor of and a major contributor to TPC's blog, TaxVox. And now let me welcome Jack Lew and Howard Gleckman to the event.
Thanks, Mark, and Secretary Lew. It's great to have you this afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Let me start with a couple of questions about COVID-19 relief. Given the severity of the pandemic and the fairly rapid action Congress took in the spring, why do you think it's taken so long for Congress to seriously consider another pandemic relief bill now?
Well, it's good to be with you, Howard, and I admire the work of the Tax Policy Center and that Mark has done in and out of government. So it's really a pleasure to join the conversation today. I think if you go back to the beginning of the COVID crisis, what was perhaps more remarkable is how much bipartisanship there was in the first rounds. It kind of stands out in not just the year, but over many years. And I think the question really is, why did it come about and where did it go? I think it came about because of the enormity of the risk and the fear that it was spiraling out of control. And I think as the situation became more familiar and candidly, as the success of the intervention muted some of the worst impact, normal politics began to take over again. I think that where the debate has been since May has been, I think, missing the point that for the close to 10 million people without work, unemployment running out and supplemental benefits running out is a tragedy. For people, 5 to 10 million people who are at risk of being evicted from their homes, failure to act in December creates a crisis that won't be easily fixed, even if there is action after January 20th. So my own view is there's urgency. At the root of your question is, why is that urgency not shared in Congress? I think the cost is part of it. We're now talking about having spent trillions of dollars as if that's a normal thing. It's not a normal thing to be spending trillions of dollars. You look at the response to the Great Recession in its entirety, it was about $1 trillion. This package, if it's in the form of the bipartisan compromise, will be about the size of the response to the Great Recession. I think that's needed, and we can talk about what the impact on fiscal policy is. I also think it's an odd moment for there to be a rediscovery of fiscal discipline. I mean, the time to worry about fiscal discipline is when the economy is doing well and you can do something about it. At a time when the economy is heading into a very difficult new round of crisis, to me is the time for action. On the upside, I'm optimistic that the tone of the discussion over the last week has been materially different. The mix of policies they're talking about, if you're going to shrink the package, is the right mix. My own view is that the targeting of relief where it's most needed, to people without jobs, to people who don't have enough food to put on the table, who are at risk of eviction in state and local government, that's the right focus. So I think keeping it focused, this bill, if it's $900-ish billion, would make a big difference, but it won't be the end.
So one of the big pieces missing, this almost follows step by step the outline of the CARES Act, except one big piece is missing, and that is the stimulus payments. Treasury, of course, got out hundreds of millions of payments very rapidly. And a lot of people argue that that's probably the most effective thing that they could do now, yet that's missing from this. Is that a mistake?
So it's actually not my view that it's the most effective thing. I think that if you look at the efficiency of the stimulus payments going to people who are in the most need, it doesn't come close to either unemployment or food assistance or keeping people in their own homes. I think if you compare it to some of the business relief, it's a closer call. But I think if you're looking at a package right now, to me, the priorities are clear, and the direct payments are well down on the list after all the things I mentioned, including state and local relief. If we end up seeing 1 million, 2 million, 3 million fewer state and local jobs as we go into the depths of this next, I think, pretty dark period, that will cause both macroeconomic pain and human suffering, both in terms of services lost and incomes lost. So it's not my view that it's at the top of the list. I actually think it's right for it to be lower down on the list. In a larger package, there'd be room for it, but not in the smaller package. Interesting.
One of the criticisms, of course, is if you use the unemployment system in many states is so inefficient that it's not a great way. The benefit is well targeted, but the mechanism for getting it to people who need it is not great. Sounds like that doesn't bother you so much.
Well, you have a choice of we don't have a perfect solution. It's actually pretty shocking that in 21st century United States, we don't have the ability to deliver targeted, well-engineered benefits quickly when you need to. But the reality is we don't. We don't have it at the federal level. We don't have it at the state level. So you can give an across-the-board tax cut to everyone below a certain threshold. But what does that mean? If somebody is making $20,000 or $40,000 a year and they get that payment, they're pretty likely to spend it. If they're making $100,000 a year, they're much less likely to spend it. And an awful lot of those direct payments go at the high end, and it's not that efficient. You flip it over, it's a cumbersome system working through the 50 states. I think it's less cumbersome now than it was at the beginning of the pandemic because the systems are in place and working. And to keep people on who would otherwise be falling off is easier than getting them on in the first place. And to figure out how to add a $300 or whatever the bump up will be is easier now than it was when the $600 benefit hadn't been there before. It's not, neither is perfect. I think targeting it is the right answer though. What we do know is, if you want efficiency is if you put money on a snap card. You can do that by programming a computer. If you want to get money to people who are really hurting, you can do that almost instantaneously. So I've always, since SNAP has been an electronic benefit payment, and since we've been doing stimulus packages like 09 and now, I've thought that is both in terms of equity and efficiency at the very top of the list in terms of effective mechanisms. It's not always as popular as across the board tax cuts are. But if you're talking about efficiency, it wins hands down.
Let's pivot, if we can, to President-elect Biden. So he, like every presidential candidate, made a long list of ambitious campaign proposals. More than 50 tax proposals, healthcare and Social Security reform, fighting climate change, raising the minimum wage, and on and on. Yet he comes into office with one immediate domestic priority, and that's getting control of the pandemic. So my question is, assuming he can manage to control COVID-19, what do you think his top domestic priority ought to be from that list of longer term priorities?
So that's a pretty big assumption because controlling COVID-19 is not something that's just one wave of a wand. I think in all likelihood, there'll be several pieces to it. Whatever happens, hopefully before the end of the year, I think we'll leave unfinished business in terms of emergency response. Right behind that, we're going to have a tail of economic pain that isn't quite the same as a shutdown economy. People like the folks on this webinar today have been working throughout the crisis and will continue to work either from home or back in their offices once COVID is over. For parts of the economy that have been shut down or are very much below normal level, it's going to take a long time before they come back. Some restaurants are going to be out of business. It's going to take time to open new businesses. There's been destruction in various sectors that may not all get built back. I think you're going to see lingering problems of unemployment well above pre-pandemic levels, which will justify ongoing support in the form of a recovery package-like initiative. It won't have the same character as a pandemic response. It will more likely start to look like infrastructure and modern infrastructure like 5G technology, high-speed internet. It will have the characteristics of the things that we have in the last 9 months learned you need to have in a more resilient form than they turned out to be when we went into remote work. So I think there's a lot of elements to that. Then you get to the investment program. And I would hope that there's some bridge between the two, that some of the things that are part of the investment program are also part of the next round of dealing with the immediate aftermath of the economic crisis. So take childcare, for example. You might not be able to put a permanent childcare program in place, but you ought to be able to get a piece of it in place as part of a response to the economic crisis. Why is there a big difference between what you do in response to a crisis and permanent? I think if you look at what President-elect Biden said as a candidate, he talked about paying for the longer term investments. He talked about doing the things that were a response to crisis, with emergency spending. I think it's obviously different to do things when you do it as an emergency without paying for it than it is when you start to pay for it. The long list of tax proposals comes into play when you're talking about paying for things. And that time hopefully will come. I don't think there should be a huge gap in time between these, but those are the three stages that I see.
So it sounds like your advice to the president-elect is to pick some of the, for example, some of the tax provisions, expanded child credit, expanded earned income credit, perhaps, pick some of those, put those in a bill in late January, early February, and defer the tax increases that are in his proposal for what, a year, some later
Well, I
date?
think that's a separate whether you enact and defer tax increases is different than the question of whether you do emergency spending during the crisis or not. If I had my druthers, you would do the emergency spending and the permanent programs and the pay-fors for the permanent programs with logical and sensible effective dates all at once. I don't know if that will be possible given the time. You need to respond quickly, if the economy is still in a deep amount of pain. It might take longer than that to work through some of the longer term investments. I leave it to others who are working on the details and on the timetable, how that should fit together. But I wouldn't wait until next summer to deal with the emergency issues. If it takes till the spring or summer to do some of those, I think they might come at different times. As far as when tax increases take effect, I've thought it's something of a red herring to talk about. Do you want a tax increase to hit right as the economy is coming out of a recession? We all have worked on effective dates that can deal with that, where it makes it, you can make sensible tax policy that doesn't create perverse incentives for behavior, but that puts the bulk of the tax that's raised at a time that works best for the macroeconomic conditions. So that's a design question to me, not a should you or shouldn't you. I think the tax policy issues ought to be viewed each on their own merits. I think there's a lot of good ideas that were laid out in the Biden proposals. I'm proud that many of them were things that we worked on in the Obama administration. So they're not all things that are kind of brand spanking new. And, candidly, I hope the work we did making the case for some of these things takes the edge off of them when they come back for reconsideration.
So of course, we're in a somewhat awkward situation. We don't know who's going to control the Senate. We're not going to know that until after January 5th. Assuming for the sake of this discussion that the Republicans maintain narrow control of the Senate, can you actually imagine Republicans in the Senate agreeing to tax increases on high-income individuals or tax increases on corporations?
So I think I can simplify the hypothetical, because even if there's a Democratic majority at 50-50, it's going to mean that to get a majority, you need to get the center, not just the left, in the same place. I think there's going to have to be some accommodation to that, whether the Georgia seats are Democratic or Republican. I think the campaign is one where Republicans are trying to make it seem as if those seats go Democratic, the pendulum will swing all the way. That's just not the case. There's going to be a need for negotiating with the same folks who are sitting in a room with Republicans negotiating now. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing necessarily, but it's just a reality. The difference is real, because having 50 votes that are Democratic votes gives you the ability to have a different kind of conversation than can you break a couple of Republicans free. But it doesn't put you in a place where it's a blank check to do anything that that half of the Democrats would want to do. It's going to require modulation. Now, what are the kinds of issues that people come together on? You look at things like the corporate tax rate. I suspect everyone on this webinar knows that when we were debating business tax reform not that long ago and having bipartisan negotiations during the Obama administration, nobody was asking for 21%. I mean, the bid ask in the negotiation was 25-28. And the difference between 25 and 28 wasn't a huge principled argument. It was, what could you pay for? Once they suspended the need to pay for it, they went all the way down to 21. So it seems to me that the move from 21 to 25 is done. I mean, it's like you just go back to what the business community was asking for. And the space between 25 and 28 gets back to what can we afford? And I don't think that's a hugely ideological debate. And I don't think it changes the fundamental competitiveness of the American economy. You can go through a number of the other proposals, whether it's on the principle that capital gains shouldn't go untaxed forever. I would hope that that's something you get broad agreement on. You put complicated language like stepped up basis on it, and people don't know what you're talking about. You talk about it in simple English. Should it be possible to permanently avoid paying capital gains on unearned income? I don't think most people think that's a crazy left-wing idea. You have to figure out how to modulate some of the language and design the policy to get a majority. I would be hopeful that even if, whichever the outcome of the election in January, I don't for a minute say it won't be easier if we have 50 Democratic senators. It's going to take this same exercise. I hope that there's at least a half a dozen Republicans who are open to a conversation like that. And I think some of it will depend on what are you paying for. If you can develop a consensus around the things we need to do and the things we need to pay for, then we ought to be able to have a conversation about these options, about which are the consensus ideas that you can use to pay, and to solve some of the equity issues that are so deep in our society.
So you've mentioned this conversation several times. It's this issue of paying for things, which is a some would say a quaint old idea. There's a new paper that just came out from Larry Summers and Jason Furman that argues that 30 years of low interest rates should make us rethink concerns about the federal debt. They argue that fiscal policy should focus on economic growth and not debt reduction. Are they right?
So I'm not talking about debt reduction. I'm talking about avoiding having permanent growth in deficits and debt. I think it's a while before we're going to be having a conversation about deficit and debt reduction. So I think you have to distinguish the conversation about paying for new things that we have to invest in, and when do we turn to policies that we used to call deficit reduction, that have been called by others fiscal austerity. I don't think that the time to have that conversation is now or anytime soon. We learned in 2009, 10, and 11 the danger of putting the brakes on too fast. You can slow a recovery down, and you can actually raise the risk of a double dip recession. So I think we have to be careful about moving quickly into what used to be a fairly comfortable space for many. I think, on the other hand, to think that you could spend $1, $2, or $3 trillion over 10 years above where we are now, that's not related to an emergency, is a different kind of question. So, just to be clear, I was not raising the notion that the minute the pandemic is over, we go into deficit reduction mode.
Let me ask you, from your experience on the Hill and your experience in a couple of administrations, there's often a tension between White House staff and the cabinet over who actually informs policy. In recent years, the balance seems to have tilted very much towards the White House staff. Given your experience and given what we've seen of President-elect Biden's personnel picks, how do you think this tension is going to play out in a Biden administration?
So I've sat in all the seats, and I don't criticize OMB, the White House, or Treasury, each of which I've had the privilege to lead. I think that this is an extraordinary team in so many ways, but not the least of which that it's a team that knows each other. It's a team that trusts each other. It's a team that's going to work with each other's strengths to make the whole greater than the parts. I think that's particularly important at a moment when transition is occurring over Zoom screens. It's people who can go right to work, and when they get into their new roles, not be needing on-the-job training from day one. As far as coordination goes, in the modern White House, and that's not just the last 4, 8, or 12 years, the last 25 years, there's been a lot of policy control coordination from the center. But when it comes to technical issues of things like tax policy, the coordination is really between an expert like Jason Furman at the CEA and tax policy with Mark Mazur. It's a team of professionals who are working in a specialized area. I think you're going to see that with this team. I haven't seen the sub-cabinet level appointments. None of us have. But if you can judge from the character of the appointments at the top, it will have that same character. And I'm a big believer that you try to get the most talent you can on the team in all the places, and you break down some of the silos. And, when I was at OMB, I wanted a lot of help from Treasury. And, when I was at Treasury, I wanted to give a lot of help to other departments that needed the expertise Treasury had. And I think that's how you make the best policy.
So we just have a couple of minutes. I want to follow up on one other issue here, and that's thinking a little lower level down at places like Treasury and IRS. There has been a real brain drain in those places over the last several years. What do you think the Biden administration could do to restore morale in the civil service and sort of restore the strength of the staffs at Treasury? You know those people well.
So I know the institution well. I have to say I've kept my distance from Treasury over the last 4 years. So I haven't had any direct contact with Treasury, except for occasional conversations at the most senior level. My sense is that there's still a lot of core strength at Treasury. And from what I hear, the same is true at OMB. There's been loss, but it's not irreparable loss. I think bringing in people of the character that the appointees have will in and of itself start the repair process. Having leaders who they respect and who respect them, who they know will listen to analysis. Everyone in the career staff of all the departments I've worked in has known that policymakers will make decisions that they don't like sometimes. That's not the test of whether they're doing their job. The test of whether they're doing their job is, are they informing the judgment with the best data? Are they informing it with the best analysis? And I think that, in my experience at OMB and Treasury, whether it's Janet Yellen and Wally Adeyemo or Neera Tanden or CC Rouse at the Council of Economic Advisors, these are people that they're going to recognize as both intellectual colleagues that they respect, leaders who respect them, and you're going to see that start to heal. It's a longer problem than the last 4 years. There's been a beating up on government for the better part of 30 years. I've devoted a fair amount of effort to trying to push back on that by teaching in schools of public policy and encouraging people that this is the way you can make the most difference in society. But at some point, we have to take a stock taking. And if you want the best people to go into public service, you have to stop insulting it. You have to stop putting it in a category that is not a positive one. And I'm hoping that coming out of what to me have not been a good 4 years, we're going to enter a period that is really a period of renewal in that sense.
Secretary Lew, thank you so much for taking the time. It's great to talk to you again. Stay safe. And my job now is to introduce Tracy Gordon, who will moderate our next panel on taxes in the Biden administration.
Thank you, Howard. Good to see you, and be well.
You too.
Thanks, Howard, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second part of our discussion on President-elect Biden's tax agenda. As Howard noted, candidate Biden proposed large tax increases on high-income individuals and corporations, in addition to tax cuts for low to moderate income households. However, that agenda is likely on hold as the United States confronts record hospitalizations for COVID-19, an economy that's still struggling despite an infusion of $2.6 trillion in aid in March and April. And I should say, especially certain sectors, places, and people are really still feeling the pain, including states, which I study, and I am grateful to Secretary Lew for the shout out. So with us to examine what a Biden administration's tax policy might look like in a COVID and post-COVID economy is a very thoughtful and dynamic panel. So I'll introduce them now and ask them to please turn on their cameras. In alphabetical order, Chai-Ching Wang is Senior Director of Economic Policy with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities Federal Fiscal Policy Team. She has a distinguished career teaching tax law at the graduate and undergraduate level and conducting research on tax policy at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, in addition to being a Fulbright scholar and practicing as a tax solicitor. Doug Holthaken is president of the American Action Forum. Prior to that, he served on the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission from 2003 to 2005. He led the Congressional Budget Office and also has held positions at the Council on Foreign Relations and on the John McCain presidential campaign. Jason Furman is professor of the practice of economic policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He served as chair of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, where he played a major role in developing economic policies, and he was also my boss. He's held major positions also in research and policy in places like the World Bank, Brookings Institution, and New York University's Wagner School of Public Service. So thank you all for being here. I couldn't think of a panel that I'd be more excited to have this conversation with. As Secretary Liu just said, we face a situation where success is sort of the enemy. Congress acted fast. They put about 13% of GDP into the economy in March and April. And since then, action has been very slow. There's talk now of a $908 billion bill working its way through Congress. I wonder what you all think are going to be the first items that that President-elect Biden will have to tackle in the next 6 months. Jason, I know you've written on sort of the dangers of thinking that you can go back to the well a couple of times with Congress. How do you see the next 6 months or so playing out?
Yeah, great. Tracy, thanks so much for having me here. I think that people really learned one important lesson from the financial crisis, which is that it's important to err on the side of large. We heard that over and over again. Better to make the mistake of being too large, no one regrets it being too large, et cetera. That was a really important lesson. And you saw that lesson in the CARES Act, which was enormous. 4 times larger, 5 times larger than the largest counter-cyclical stimulus we've ever done. I think there's a second important lesson from the financial crisis that we didn't learn in the CARES Act, or at least didn't embody in the CARES Act, which is that it also needs to be long-lasting. And the reason it needs to be long-lasting is if the Congress was like the Fed and they FOMC and they met every 6 weeks to review the latest data, discuss the implications of those data, and make adjustments to fiscal policy in a reasonably rational way, then I wouldn't worry about this problem. But Congress's attention sort of ebbs and flows. There was a real bipartisan moment back in March. It was clear a massive attack on our country. The response to it wasn't that polarized yet. Both sides came together. At the time I said, people said, oh, well, this will be the end of polarization. I said, no, there's going to be now something else to fight over. And by the way, Republicans will think this confirmed everything they ever thought about the ineptness of government, and Democrats confirm everything they ever thought about the importance of government. And everyone will think whatever they thought before, but even more strongly than they thought it before. That's what usually happens. And that's, I think, what has happened. So I really wish that they'd originally done something longer. The ideal way would be automatic stabilizers, where you have automatic recession insurance with triggers where things continue as long as it's needed. But barring that, just, things for the length of the pandemic, et cetera, would have been a better way to do it. And now we are where we are. We had a several-month gap. I hope Congress gets its act together and passes something, because something is better than nothing.
Sorry about that. Doug, could you comment on the end of polarization and the idea of something being better than nothing?
Well, I think my reading of the evidence is that when the country is threatened and our citizens are genuinely at risk, the Congress comes together in a bipartisan fashion and acts. And it's done that historically. It did it again in March. And then there wasn't that large threat for the next couple of months. And we didn't see any coming together. That's a plain fact. I think there's a realization now on Capitol Hill that we face a very serious threat, that we've had long-term unemployed, about 11 million people who lost their jobs in March and April, have not been able to go back to work and are running out of financial resources and facing food shortages and are in a serious threat to their well-being. And so that's a priority. And I think both sides are now talking in a tone that's very different than has been true for the past couple of months. And I'm expecting them to come together and do the right thing and get some support out there for those who really need it as we come to the end of the year. I think the main challenge, one of the great challenges for the incoming Biden administration is how do you generate bipartisan legislation when you're not facing an existential threat and where you don't have the forces driving people together out of necessity. And I just think they need to try to do business differently than previous administrations, including some I've worked in, have done business. And that means, for example, start out not with the biggest campaign promise you made, but with something that could get some bipartisan support that you think has the right scale, not too big that it falls on its own weight, but you can actually get it done and learn the lesson of legislating and write the bill and send it up to Congress. Don't let one extreme write the bill in the House and another extreme write the bill in the Senate and then say, gee, we got to come to the center somehow. Start in the middle and then provide the support to get people on board to that as necessary to pass the legislation. And that won't be the most satisfying piece of legislation by definition, but it'll be a way to provide the air cover for people to do things which are hard for them politically. It's only the White House can do this because it's the only place positioned to broker deals between Republicans and Democrats, Houses and Senates. And I think how they do their business is almost as important as what they do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I want to pivot to talk more about what they do and the design of a stimulus package. Chai-Ching, I know that you spend a lot of time thinking about the stuff that I think about as someone who studies state and local budgets. And so the sort of so-called K-shaped recovery, the idea that there are certain groups that still have, even though the overall unemployment rate is 6.7% for Blacks, it's above 10%, for Latinos above 8%. If state and local governments are safety net providers, I worry first of all about sort of lags and the effects of things happening in the economy on state and local budgets, but also that there are these groups that are suffering, and ultimately it's state and local governments that are first responders for safety net programs. So how would you prioritize the elements of a stimulus package specifically to make sure that you take care of groups that are now being so battered by this recession?
So, I think you're absolutely right. State and local aid is an absolutely critical missing piece that's been really underpowered so far in the stimulus that we've seen, and is critical for the near-term package that's being negotiated right now. Look, it's still also possible that, as Secretary Lew said, that they could pass something soon and that it's inadequate both in terms of size and in composition. And I think that we should not give in to an idea of inertia or defeatism that next year that the Senate majority won't step up and do what is clearly needed to give relief to state and local governments and households, and sort of treat it as inevitable that there'll be sort of damage through not extending stimulus further as we need it. So, I think there is going to be, as Doug and others have said, potential opportunities to come back and look at policies, including state and local aid, but others that are well targeted and have potential bipartisan support that could help sort of take the edge off that K shape that you were talking about. And one particular aspect of the K that I've been really concerned about is the K, not just for the workers that are out of work and are hardest hit by the earnings losses, but the long-term impacts for their children as well. We could see a really long-term K in terms of the second generation impacts for kids that are least able to sort of bridge the gap in terms of continuing access to education, but also basics like food and shelter and all of those other necessities that we know have really long-term and long-lasting impacts on children's outcomes, both in their formative years, but also in their earnings as adults. So if that stepping up doesn't happen, we have the potential to see a K that sort of continues on into the second generation. And the sort of the rationale that might be given for under investing or not coming back for a second round if it's needed next year is this concern about long-term deficit challenges and debt. And you hear a lot about saddling future generations with increases in debt. But I think one needs to keep in very sharp focus the fact that the second generations, and particularly the ones that are most vulnerable, children of color, children in very low income households, children in geographies that have been hurt the hardest by this recession, are going to be experiencing pretty long-lived harms if we don't step up and do more if this upcoming package is still inadequate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely want to talk about the debt later. But I'm curious, Jason, you mentioned automatic stabilizers. And if we had a better set of automatic stabilizers going into this, perhaps things wouldn't have been as bad. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of mechanisms that you would envision to make sure that aid doesn't turn off prematurely?
Yeah, and I agreed with almost everything Doug said. I do think part of why we come together is because we're attacked by something bigger. But I think part of why is that we do it at the beginning and not at the end. So we did a stimulus on a bipartisan basis in January 2008 when the unemployment rate, I think, was still in the 4s. We did unemployment insurance when the unemployment rate was 5% in 2008, but we allowed it to expire when the unemployment rate was still 8% 5 years later. And so I think there is a time element to all of this, which is part of what motivates it. I have a proposal with Willie Powell and Matt Fiedler on Medicaid matching rates, make those a function of state unemployment rates. Medicaid matching rates are already a function of state economic conditions, in particular their incomes, but it compares their income to the average income. So they don't on average go up or down in any year, they just change order a little bit between states. You basically make almost one tweak to that formula and you can offset 2/3 of the revenue loss in the way we did the parameters that states face in recessions. You could dial it whatever way you want. Unemployment insurance is another one where there's a very strong logic. There's partly a macro logic, but also a micro logic. The way you balance the disincentive to work against the benefits of consumption smoothing depends on how problematic the disincentives to work are. In a 15% unemployment economy, they're barely problematic at all. In a 3%, you'd worry more. And so you'd have your unemployment insurance adjust is another thing. You could do it for nutritional assistance. You could do it for stimulus checks. You could do it for some business tax provision. But I think those are the two strongest cases, are FMAP and unemployment insurance.
Doug, could you comment on that? Because I remember seeing you testify at the House Budget Committee right before all this stuff happened and saying that you would just like to see more evidence on the inadequacy of automatic stabilizers as they existed back then.
So I understand the principles that Jason just elucidated, that they make perfect sense. I'm just not confident we can write down the formulas the way he is. To go to 15 from 3, yeah, sure. We know that that's a big difference. Well, what's the shape of that look like? How big is the change in the unemployment benefit? And on all of these things, I think there's a real potential for not being able to anticipate future conditions appropriately and having the wrong automated responses in place. And so I'm very concerned about the execution of this agenda as a general matter. I'm also just, I believe that the creation of mandatory spending is the original sin of federal budget. Until we created mandatory programs, we could balance budgets, control debt, run our fiscal affairs. Once we created mandatory programs, we've lost control. And in the 21st century, the United States has never stabilized its debt or its carrying cost of that debt, Jason, relative to GDP. Just hasn't. A minimum condition for a sovereign nation is to be able to do that. And we haven't displayed the capacity to do that, and adding more mandatory programs would just make it harder. So not a fan.
It's a great time to talk about taxes because we're here with the Tax Policy Center, and another way that the US is pretty much an outlier in terms of other countries is its tax to GDP ratio, even outside a recession, is like just right down the bottom of the list. So
it's both sides of the budget. I don't dispute that a bit. We don't raise taxes, we don't control spending, we don't have very good budgets.
I mean, I think, Doug, you might have more faith in the discretionary actions and wisdom of Congress on an annual basis than I do. I look at the appropriations process and it's a disaster. And then I look back at, for example, Social Security. Social Security benefits used to not be indexed. So what did Congress do? In election years, they voted big increases. They, in fact, voted bigger increases before they indexed it than what has happened after they indexed it. So I think sometimes you can sort of sit sit down and write down something better in advance that has more wisdom embodied in it than you're capable of showing on sort of an annual ongoing basis.
The question is whose wisdom, Jason? Because I don't know that I have more faith, but I do think that in a representative democracy, that's how those decisions should be made. We might not always personally like the outcomes, but attempts to bypass Congress are attempts to bypass the elected will of the people. I don't think that's right.
But Congress passed a law that said Medicaid matching is a function of your per capita income relative to the average per capita income. That's a formula. They legislated a formula. You could change the formula. That would still be democratic. We'd still be, a sovereign country. I think it would be a better formula. But I don't quite know what the
I want to tap into that because there are ways that we should change the formulas, right? And there are many people who say that we should be using poverty instead of per capita income as a measure of need for Medicaid. And the unemployment insurance system has formulas that I think everyone acknowledges don't work for EB, for the extended benefits program. So Chai-Ching, have you put any thought into this, and what kind of formulas or triggers would you like to see in a stimulus bill?
Okay, I think this is a super interesting conversation, and there has been a lot of great proposals that have been put forward recently that would fix this problem for the next time round, and we should obviously grab any opportunity that there is to do it. But I'm a little bit more immediately concerned about some of the impacts of things that are in law where basic design issues have led to perverse outcomes that need to be sort of fixed pretty immediately. So one of those situations that's looming in the next filing season, for example, is that a lot of people that have had their incomes or earnings hit due to the pandemic and recession will then file expecting a refund to tide them over as they do in many years if they're low and moderate income, and face a shock when they find that their refund is much lower than expected because their earnings have dropped and therefore their eligibility for refundable tax credits has also dropped. There's a whole series of these other little features that are looming for the coming filing season and are likely to extend into 2022 because as much as we would like everything to be back to normal and sort of income volatility and unemployment to be recover as much as possible next year, the likelihood is that there's still going to be quite a lot of uncertainty. So there are a lot of near-term fixes to some of those issues that could be really important, along with looking forward in a way that we didn't quite get to coming out of the last recession, even though folks like Jason and yourself have been telling us for years that we should be getting this in place ahead of the next recession, and here we are hopefully coming out of it facing the same problem.
So let's talk about the medium term. Let's talk about in this world after we have a vaccine and maybe the Biden administration can pivot and start thinking about tax policy again. Chai-Ching, you mentioned a couple of things that could be done, maybe by tweaking the law slightly or regulatory changes. I guess, Doug, what do you see as sort of areas for potential bipartisan compromise on taxes?
Well, I think the places where there's the broadest agreement is at the low end, right? So expanding the EITC has been on the agenda for lots of bipartisan groups for a while. Child credits, similar possibilities. So I think that's one place. I think that if they sort of really tried hard, they might be able to get to something in the way of a parental leave program. I think there's a clear appetite for that and paying for it's always been the problem. So there's some places where I think they actually could make some progress in the medium term. If you want to let my fantasies run wild, I'd like to see them actually fix the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act genuinely, technical corrections, plus putting things in law so the Treasury isn't supposed to stand on its head and interpret them. But I'm not sure that they can come together.
Well, say more about those fixes.
Oh, the international tax regime envisioned by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is not what got passed and then had to be subject to rulemaking by the Treasury. So they need to go back and try again in terms of just drafting. It was really poorly drafted. But that then raises the question: can you get agreement to stay with a more territorial approach to the international tax regime? And I'm not sure that's where there's enough consensus for. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Jason, do you want to say anything about the rulemaking process and like the high tax exemption and other aspects of foreign taxation?
Yeah, I have something to say, which is I want to hear what Chai-Ching has to say.
I mean, I think it's one of the really major levers that there is in tax policy that's immediate. Although I would just sort of put a pin in it and say that I think there are actually 7 other buckets of things we could look for tax policy action. But I think this bucket is a really exciting one. Look, as Doug flagged, the implementation of the 2017 tax law left a whole ton of things to Treasury and the IRS to figure out in very quick order. And there's been a lot of very consequential regulatory decisions made pretty recently. And we don't know the total of the total impact of those reg decisions, but we do know, for example, that just the international provisions might have added about 100 billion to the cost of the law compared to JCT's initial estimate. And that's just the federal impact, Tracy, because as you know, a lot of states hook up to these decisions, both in the law and regulatory. So you've got state policy impacts as well. And at a time where Treasury and IRS had to deal with sort of more than 150 comments, notices, proposed regs, temporary regs for sort of 3 years in a row every single year, it seems, as part of normal regulatory best practice, you might want to go back and take a look and see if there are things that need to be clarified or tweaked. But there are additionally those areas where folks have flagged that the regs may not have taken the best interpretation of the tax law. And in some cases, people are arguing that have overstepped the bounds of the statutory authority. So the 2017 tax law regs are a sort of a really sort of hot button issue in terms of what a new administration could take a look at. There's also a lot of things outside that area. There are Obama era administrative decision making that sort of got put into place and pulled back, and there's questions about whether to reinstate some of those. Again, we don't know the sort of net impact of all of those. I think the fact that we don't know the net impact is one of the sort of most damning things I can say about the new OIRA process. We're supposed to have more and better information about the impact of regulatory decisions, but can't really say the cost and distributional impact of most of the large 2017 tax law regulations that went through. So I think figuring out what those impacts are and revisiting them and looking for opportunities to improve guidance, clarity, and policy decisions where there have been policy decisions made is an exciting area.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the individual provisions of the TCJA expire in a couple of years. Is there some opportunity for deal making there? I guess going back to this question of bipartisan compromise.
Let me see if I can just sort of tick through and folks can jump in if I can try and sort of enumerate some of the different areas of potential action that we've been seeing. There's the regulatory piece. There is these expiring provisions. They actually start at the end of 2021. The first big one up is the R&E provision that starts a forcing mechanism. There's the normal tax extenders that have to be dealt with, might be dealt with in appropriations, might still be left over next year. There is the potential for disaster relief to have to pass next year if we see another year of hurricanes and Dracos and goodness knows what, but there has to be action around, and that could involve tax provisions like allowing those look backs, both locally and potentially nationally. But there's also multilateral action that's happening in the G20 and OECD, which potentially forces some broad policy decisions about posture towards international tax. And then I think, as Secretary Treasury Liu flagged, at some point an offset discussion may start, whether it's around an infrastructure package or something that's sort of more on the longer term front. And we can argue about what the right rule of thumb might be as to for whether something needs to be paid for, but there is potential to actually secure good policies in that process. And then finally, there's appropriations, and I want to make a big plug, and I saw in the chat, appropriations come up every year, and every year I think people that care about good tax policy and administration have got to fight like crazy to get the IRS resource that it needs. We've seen over the CARES Act, dependent on the IRS as our best delivery system for a whole lot of things, and yet we've spent the last decade sort of hurting ourselves in that front by just totally under-resourcing them.
Mm-hmm. So Jason or Doug, what do you see as the prospects for increasing the IRS's budget? And there are widely different estimates for what that would bring in terms of revenues. I know that Larry Summers and Natasha Sarin have a paper saying that they expect about $100 billion coming out of, I'm sorry, excuse me, $1 trillion coming out of that, of which about $700 billion would come from just increased audits. And I know the CBO's estimates are much lower. So I guess first, what are the political prospects of that happening? And then secondly, how much do you think that would yield? Where in that range do you see the outcome?
Tracy, first of all, in terms of the numbers, I think CBO has a very high estimate for the rate of return, and Larry and Natasha have a very, very high estimate. Mm-hmm. And, I can't adjudicate between the very high and very, very high, but either one would be worth doing. I hope Doug is a little bit more optimistic than me. I've sometimes found Republicans were more open to administering and enforcing than one might think. But in every appropriations battle, usually we in the Obama administration went in with three top priorities. Number one, ACA funding. Number two, IRS funding. And for those of you who can't guess the third, IMF quota increase funding, which we finally got in 2015. And we just fought like crazy for them against tons of resistance, and weren't wholly successful in those fights. And so a lot got eroded. So I worry, but I'd love to hear from Doug that I'm 4 years out of date.
I think your worries are well founded, and this has never historically been a very successful area. But they did get together to do some serious bipartisan reforms of the IRS and its structure a little while back, and the money to support those reforms is necessary, and that's the bipartisan case to be made, that you need to piggyback on that effort to put the money in place for it to be successful. And so that raises the probabilities in this case. But I think it's fair to expect it to be a tough lift. It'll be maybe in the first draft of each appropriations bill in each house. But then when they get to conference and have to start trading stuff out, my prediction is it's one of the first things to go. Always has been.
Let me try to add additional optimism, because I promised to bring that today. But the goodwill, I think, is real from the CARES Act implementation issues. There is that bipartisan bill that Doug mentioned, and that is in train in terms of its implementation as well. I think the rhetoric has died down to levels that are lower than it has been in the last sort of decade or so. And there are some, I think, yes, it's hard to look at the last 10 years and extrapolate from that trend line and think that this is going to be the year that we sort of turn into a V. But it is notable that the last year is the first year in which we haven't actually cut IRS enforcement funding further. So there is potential that there's a turning point sitting there ready to be.
I really would like to be more optimistic. I would, because as a matter of the facts on the ground, I think I'm in the end an institutionalist who values Treasury, OMB, and the governance part of the mission, and it's been underfunded for a long time, and all of those places are suffering as a result. So the question is, can you get the politics to align to sort of restore that? And I think a good step is to move away from an administration that openly belittles public service, and maybe that'll help.
I think to be even more ridiculously optimistic, I mean, even this last administration included in its budgets proposals to lift enforcement funding by allowing funding above the Budget Control Act caps. So, I mean, even this administration was not actively seeking further cuts in the enforcement budget. So, maybe if I'd said I'd come today with a balanced view on everything, I would give you a slightly less optimistic view on this. But I promised an optimistic one, so there's my best go.
Secretary Liu mentioned that the sort of bid ask between proposals on corporate tax rates was about 25 to 28 during the Obama administration, and now we have a 21% corporate income tax rate. Do you think that there might be some room for a deal in terms of increasing the rate in favor of some of the domestic production subsidies that President-elect Biden talked about during the campaign.
So why don't I do substance and then I'll do politics, and unfortunately they're not completely aligned. On substance, I think we need to be worried a lot more about the tax base than about the tax rate. And if you get the tax base right, then the rate matters a whole lot less. I have a proposal that, I'll bet I could get, possibly, 300, 400 votes for at the National Tax Association meetings, a lot fewer in Congress. It would be, and it's very similar to what Doug worked with the, House Republicans on. It would have expensing. It would eliminate the interest deduction. And once you do that, it would raise the rate. I propose 28. And you have more of an incentive to invest in new capital, less of a windfall for old capital. And I think that would be more efficient and be raise additional revenue. The problem is the business community loves tax breaks for old capital. They care much more about the average tax rate than the marginal tax rate. Economists think the marginal tax rate matters. They think they want a low tax bill. And so there's not a lot of business constituency for this. There's not a lot of Democratic enthusiasm for expensing, and there's not a lot of Republican enthusiasm outside of the sort of seminar circles that Doug conducted before people entered the real world and noticed that DBCFT wasn't that popular on the Republican side, I think. So, I think that is something one could do. One could raise the rate and be efficient. Even if one didn't do that, yeah, I'd be comfortable raising the rate to 25 or 28 without changing the tax base, given what I see around the world. If you have 50 Democratic senators, maybe that's something you could do. But, I think it's a bit of a challenge right now. I think at some point, though, we're going to do something to get additional revenue. And this may be one of the low-hanging fruits of all the things, because everything is hard.
Well, I think Jason said it right on the politics. There's no question, and I agree with his proposal. It makes perfect sense. But I think the one thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't really matter how it looks out there right now. We do big tax bills so infrequently that what really matters is how far out of line will we be from our developed competitors 5-10 years down the road. And we really saw that with the 86 Act, where that was the lowest corporate rate on the globe at the time. And by the time we got to 2017, we were way out of line. We got to the middle of the developed country pack with 21. I expect us to be trailing the rear end of the pack in 5-10 years. And so going back to 28 quickly doesn't appeal to me from that perspective. I mean, I don't miss the annual battle over inversions and headquarter relocations and Benedict Arnold firms and all of that junk. That just stopped overnight. And I don't feel like turning it back on in the near future.
I want to remind everyone that we're going to have a Q&A in a couple of minutes, so please keep submitting your questions to the chat. I also wanted to change gears a little bit and talk about the longer term. Chai-Ching, you mentioned in our prep call that administrations have opportunities to kind of seed ideas in the budget or in the Green Book for several years, and Secretary Lew mentioned that he thought some of the groundwork that the Obama administration had done was sort of reaped in the candidate Biden's proposals. So, some of the ideas that were talked about in the campaign were things like phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. The choice for Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has mentioned support for a carbon tax. What are some of the big ideas that you all see on the horizon that the Biden administration might start building support for out of the gate?
Well,
anyone? Yeah.
I'll go first. I mean, if I had, my fondest of dreams, they would push hard for a textbook upstream carbon tax that included border adjustment and using the revenues to follow the rules of the double dividend and lower distorting taxes on capital and labor. That the reason I prefer that is that, number one, the president-elect has said this is the preeminent challenge of our time, and so addressing it would be useful. Number two, There is no addressing it without a global effort that's effective and not just notional. And there will be no such effort without US leadership. And so we have to find a way to get the US comfortable leading on this issue. I do not believe the American public is prepared to take a risk with their economy in the interest of global leadership on climate issues. And that recipe, a revenue neutral carbon tax, places no risk on the economic growth trajectory. And they need to be educated on that front. And that would allow leadership to take place much more easily. And then you can build from there. But that's the core thing, a highly economically efficient carbon policy that makes the US more comfortable getting out over its skis a little bit. And without that, I just don't see big progress being made on that front.
Cheng or Jason, do you want to comment on climate or other priorities that might be realized over the longer term?
Yeah, I incredibly enthusiastic about carbon taxes. I think that is an issue where there is a growing elite support. You look at something like the Climate Leadership Council, which has a carbon tax, swaps it for regulations, rebates it lump sum. I think 2/3 of people are made better off. I can't remember the exact numbers, might be more than that. And it has border adjustment. It still hasn't filtered all the way into Congress again, like some other issues, but you do have, everything from oil companies, which by the way have more of an interest in a carbon tax than you might think, given the way the transition would function vis-a-vis natural gas, and environmental groups. I really, really hope we get there one day. But I don't think we can let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think there's other things we can do in the interim, some of them on a regulatory basis, things like the Clean Power Plan that we did in our administration, bringing that back. It obviously faces legal challenges. I'm not an expert in how best to handle them, but something like that is worth doing. And finally, I'd say, partly I judge a policy as, does it pass a cost benefit test? The Clean Power Plan, for example, did to the tune of tens of billions of dollars of net benefits. But also, does it raise or lower the probability that we act in the future in a way that is even better? And I think things like Clean Power Plan do create that opportunity. They drive down the price of alternatives, which will make it easier to do a carbon tax. And they are effectively a state-by-state solution, which I think would lead a lot of companies to clamber for a national solution, which is more efficient than having each state regulate separately, which is what we have now.
I think the Biden campaign proposals have a lot of already very ambitious proposals in both the revenue raising space, including especially the taxation of income from capital and wealth, and in the low and moderate income space, where there's a lot of focus on reaching people through various tax provisions that are currently completely upside down, in the sense that they deliver tax incentives or credits to people that already have the ability to do the thing that the tax incentive is trying to reach. So in the home ownership space and a lot of all of these other spaces. Now the challenges around those are going to be administration and implementation challenges, and I think that will be a place where moving the design conversation forward into the details could be, and having those ready for a potential enactment. If there is a rather large package, is going to be an important place to look at and to focus. But even before that, I think we've mentioned a couple of times that there's potential bipartisan agreement around investing in low and moderate income children through an expansion of the child tax credit, for example. That is a little more straightforward in terms of implementation, but still poses some challenges in terms of ensuring that all the new people that would be eligible, just like in the CARES Act, are actually able to access the credit. So there's plenty of both near-term and long-term policy design, especially on the administration end, where I think we need to be sort of looking at this as an opportunity to really get ready for even bigger steps should that opportunity open up.
Mm-hmm. And I promised that we would talk about debt. So Jason, you and Larry Summers have a paper about the implications of a low interest rate environment. And if I remember correctly, the three takeaways at the end for fiscal policy were that responses to emergencies broadly defined should not be paid for. Long-term priorities should be paid for with some exceptions. And that the government should think about sort of shaping demand and providing appropriate fiscal support in various ways. I think the third one, I'm reading the third takeaway, but as someone who worked with you on infrastructure a little bit, I wonder if you could elaborate on the second point and what does the low interest rate environment imply for infrastructure investment and how might that be structured?
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about the debt is in the year 2000, the debt was quite low. How much would you have needed to raise taxes to retire it? The answer was about 0.5%. A lot of uncertainty in that because you're projecting over time, et cetera. Now the debt is 3 times higher relative to the economy and 4, 5, 6, I don't know, times higher in nominal or real terms. How much would you have to raise taxes to retire the debt over time? The answer is still 0.5%. Why is that? The debt's a lot higher, but interest rates are a lot lower. There's a lot of projection that just went into what I just said. So I think it's easier to and preferable to use debt service, the amount of interest you're paying, as a share of the economy. So I think we need a really different way we think about fiscal sustainability. More importantly, we need to come at this from a macroeconomic perspective. Our fundamental problem as a country isn't that our debt is too high. Our fundamental problem as a country is that our interest rates are too low. That causes, makes it hard to respond to recessions. It causes increased financial fragility and bubbles. And it may even make it harder to generate growth in normal times. And focusing on solving that problem is a more important, is sort of the right thing, more fundamental macroeconomic problem, rather than a pretty artificially construed debt sustainability one. Now that means, based on current forecasts of debt service as a share of the economy, there is fiscal room in the United States. Our short run problem is we need to do more to deal with the recession that we're still in. Our long run problem is we need more investment of every type. When it comes to infrastructure investment, Tracy, I actually would prefer to pay for it because I like the pay fors. I like a gas tax. I like a vehicle miles traveled and the like. So if you're doing a tax that involves improving the way we use our infrastructure, I would actually do that. But I wouldn't hold it up over that. And when it comes to investments in preschool and the like, let's not pay for them. Let's just do them. The evidence is that they very plausibly pay for themselves in present value. And if they don't, there's enough room to fit them in anyway.
Doug, do you want to say anything on debt?
Yeah, I don't disagree greatly with Jason in terms of the importance of placing better growth at the center of the agenda, and the idea that our interest rates are too low. We're not always worried about interest rates going up. I mean, throw us in that briar patch. We want to have that problem. I just once you put all those things together, there still has to be a priority, in my view, in stabilizing the interest costs, the carrying costs of the debt relative to GDP, because we just haven't. And that's a troubling long-term phenomenon. So that there's nothing about 2020 that says you got to start dealing with this. There's nothing about 2021, 2022, probably even 2025. We can do some of these things, but there has to be a recognition that at some point in the future, the lines for revenue have to go up, spending have to go down, and the carrying costs stabilize relative to GDP. And we just have never done that. Even though, Jason would argue, it's a small change. It just hasn't happened.
All right, I have a bunch of questions in the chat. One is about the shift away from itemizing because of the double standard deduction, and that's set to expire in 2025. So The question that was posed was how you all see people's behavior adjusting to that. Well, I guess first, if you see it surviving past the scheduled expiration, and then secondly, if you see a permanent shift in people itemizing on their taxes.
We can all do the fanciest tax reforms in the world, but almost nothing is better for simplification than just raising the standard deduction, which isn't rocket science. I think we should have a revenue baseline that has the tax cuts expiring. If they have to expire to get the additional revenue, I would do that. I'd rather have the extra revenue with the old individual tax code. But even better would be, some revenue neutral reform relative to the revenue that we have in law in 2026, 2027, and the like, where we kept the larger standard deduction, kept the larger child tax credit, kept the SALT repeal, the SALT limit, and made some other changes to raise the revenue to where it would otherwise have risen to.
And I think that the increase in the standard deduction does just sort of put a spotlight on how skewed some of the benefits of itemization are. So what you have left over of the mortgage interest deduction now is, yes, smaller in dollar terms, but even more skewed to high income and high wealth people that are able to afford to purchase homes and pay for their mortgage interest anyway. And I think, as I was mentioning before, I think there are a suite of different proposals in the Biden campaign proposals that seek to direct some of the tax expenditure towards those people that actually do need the assistance to, for example, rent, purchase homes, save, and in the case of the child tax credit, just simply afford the costs of having children in a really tough economy in which many low and moderate income people work very hard for very low pay or are shut out of the labor market altogether. So all of those things I think would sort of help and could be looked at in concert with what's left over of the remaining itemized deductions that are not very well targeted.
There are a number of questions in the chat about income inequality and using the tax system to combat income inequality as well as structural racism. The Biden campaign proposed ending the step up in basis at death, as well as treating capital gains as ordinary income. What do you all see as the prospects for those proposals?
So I think this is one of the areas where it's really important to both sort of seize the opportunities that are regulatory immediately and also sort of start building the devil in the detail towards some of those big proposals that are sound policy and should be enacted at some point in the future. If that point in the future is maybe in a couple of years' time, depending on the outcome of the Georgia races, I think we would like there to be highly detailed legislation that has been developed on the Hill or elsewhere that's ready for those sorts of potential moves, because what we absolutely don't want is a situation like in the 2017 tax law where a whole lot of difficult issues are left to Treasury and IRS to have to sort of figure out on the fly without absolutely clear statutory authority, and then makes it open to sort of rifle shot holes being put in the legislation either through the legislative process or in the regulatory process or in the courts after that. So I think there's actually a nice little bit of time here to not just sort of forget about those those issues, but to really continue to work on developing them in a way that when there is the moment, they can be enacted in a way that's as robust and as efficient as possible. Because if you do want to raise taxes on high income people, on capital income and wealth that's not going taxed, as I would prefer in my sort of set of policy preferences, if that were to happen, I think most sort of tax policy experts would prefer that it happen in a way that was rational and efficient and didn't open its way up to just pure tax avoidance and in terms of paper shuffling and opening up horizontal inequities by people just avoiding the rules.
So as a matter of political handicapping, I guess I'm slightly pessimistic on both of these. And in terms of the sort of the way to go, I have always thought we needed to be more aggressive about the reforms that we do for transfers at the end of life. I would much rather scrap the system we've got and move to an inheritance tax where you're taxed on the amount that you receive and not having an estate tax. And I have always preferred a consumption tax base, or moving that direction as the lodestar for the income tax reforms. And that would say, don't fully tax capital gains unless you get a full upfront deduction. And so you just have to figure out how you want to do that implementation. You can either have it with or without the taxation of capital gains.
So I think, Doug, even on the sort of inheritance tax front, some of the incremental changes that one might make through regulation to the current estate and gift tax regime could actually help you think through the hard technical issues that you would face in the inheritance tax. So I'm thinking about an Obama era regulation that looked at how to value assets that are sort of wrapped up in closely held and other various ownership structures. You need to figure out basic issues of valuation and ownership, whether you're dealing with the current estate tax, ending step-up basis, or an inheritance tax. So I think some of those building blocks, now is the time to really kind of figure through some of the details that would feed into a sort of robust regime of any of those flavors.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Those valuation issues are just really difficult and important.
So there's also, there was a lot of care taken during the campaign. The Biden administration limited all tax increases to taxpayers earning more than $400,000 a year. Do you think that that's realistic, that there'll have to be more give in terms of raising taxes on people who would fall below that income threshold?
Who fall below or above?
Below. So
No,
is it possible to spare middle income taxpayers?
Yeah, I mean, the congressional dynamics are, we had 250. I would go to Congress and say, oh, and it's not 250. And they'd be like, oh, in my district, there's this person struggling to get by on 500,000. In my district, there's this person struggling to get by at 750,000. This is the Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
I think at one point, several leaders in Congress floated 1 million as the place to start. So I think 400,000 is fine. I think there's a lot you can do above that. I think as a policy level, you're going to need to do more than you can do eventually. But in the nearer term, I think the risk is that the threshold in the congressional process goes up from 400,000, not that it goes down.
I think it's a staging and priorities matter, given the state of income inequality, given the state of the K-shaped recession. The first place that you should be looking for revenue is people that are well-resourced and are able to contribute more. I think so. I think once we have had a look at some of the sources of income that currently don't go taxed at all, that primarily accumulate up there, I think it would be a very fair thing to sort of be putting a lot of pressure on that line and thinking about it more. But for the moment, in terms of priority issues, there's a lot to do at the top. And in terms of again, sort of first cab off the rank and potentially hard political situations, money for tax enforcement and enforcing the laws that Congress has already passed and are on the books and are supposed to be the tax law that people face in reality as a way to raise revenue that really is one that there shouldn't be sort of quibbling about.
I guess the thing I'd worry about if I was, the Biden administration on the substances, these are by definition discretionary tax increases. And what we know from the work of David and Christine Romer is that those are among the most damaging things you can do coming out of a recession. And raise, taxes as a fraction of GDP by a percentage point to get ultimately an impact of 3% of GDP. We don't need any headwinds like that. So I understand the equity issues. I understand the desire to address them, but doing it at the expense of the low-income workers and communities of color that are being hurt right now, I think is not a wise idea.
We're going to have to wrap up in a couple of minutes. I just want to do one more rapid fire round with everyone to sort of talk about your top hopes and fears for the Biden administration. So what do you hope to see at the end of, say, a 4-year term? Hopes and fears.
So my biggest hope is that they've reestablished a tradition of bipartisan legislating that is different in its substance and also its form than we've seen thus far in the 21st century. I mean, people who were good at this, Reagan's, Clinton's, operated differently and operated effectively. Wasn't done by my old President W. We didn't see it in the Obama administration. The Trump administration couldn't pass legislation to save its soul. So, that's a big challenge. And that is my greatest hope for the next administration. And my biggest fear is that they fail and that we sit in gridlock for 4 years. I think that would be a national travesty.
Teaching, hope and fear.
I mean, I think progress towards and beyond a lot of the campaign proposals that they've laid out would be terrific. I think another place where, it's easy to underestimate the value of sort of rebuilding those infrastructure, institutions and infrastructure that Secretary Lew mentioned. The sort of morale, revisiting institutional decisions like OIRA review, looking at the sort of strength of other process decisions that set up for how many people and what type of people weigh in on regulatory comments, for example, or how often and what sources of the tax gap do we focus on in terms of annual reports. All of those sorts of things, there's a lot of opportunity to make really big strides on. And I've been very clear that I'm wearing my optimist hat the whole of this session, so I'm going to take a pass on the fears.
There's so many things to fear these days. Jason, how about you?
Yeah. If the United States, the difference in the United States being a really, really great country and just a great country 20 years from now probably has very little to do with what our debt is relative to a share of the economy 20 years from now. Probably has relatively little to do with what our interest payments are as a share of GDP 20 years from now. I think it first and foremost has to do with people here in the United States contributing to our economy and having more people and better people contributing to our economy. So what does that mean? One thing it means is immigration. This is something that the business community agrees on, the evangelical community, a certain amount of the law enforcement community, and the like. It's something that passed on a bipartisan basis in the Senate during the Obama administration. That's a great way to have more people and super talented people contributing to making America a better place. So much more important than any of the fiscal issues any of us spend our time on, including myself. Second, better people, preschool for everyone, more childcare, improving education, shifting to a better way of financing college. I propose larger expansions as pay as you earn, income-driven payment, and the like. Third, the infrastructure and ideas those people can work with, roads, bridges, research, all of those also have a certain amount of bipartisan support. So I think an agenda like that, that's truly about making America greater, could have bipartisan appeal. I think a lot of it is in the campaign platform already, and that's what I very much hope happens. My fear is that nothing happens. And that we have gridlock, and that leads to just more polarization, more acrimony, and more dysfunction.
Jason has enough fears to go around, and so does Doug. You don't need mine.
Well, I would just say that even if the benefit of immigration is not fiscal, there would be obviously the shot in the arm for Social Security, which we didn't get a chance to talk about, and looking at state pensions. There's certainly a number of states that would benefit from having a big influx of workers and young people that pay into the system, or that are employed and they're contributing to pensions. So thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to have to go. I just want to say that this is actually one in a series of events we hope to have on the Biden administration's tax and budget policy. So please stay tuned and keep following us at the Tax Policy Center. Thank you all very much for participating. Great to see you.